There is a reason that fashion shoots and TV and films, they always go to country houses and stately homes.
Yes, that's true.
And I think we take it for granted because we live here. These were banqueting houses, right? So they were built for the purpose of basically having dessert, a kind of after-dinner party house. Our ability to have a navy and to have these connections all around the world really brought in huge amounts of wealth to Britain's story, and the stately home is with that. I think Blenheim Palace is a high point if you want to talk about stately homes. It's like the real exemplar of absolute grandeur.
In 1933, he had one of his big parties and burnt the whole thing down.
Good gracious.
Yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't just civil wars that were bringing these houses down.
Yeah, exactly.
Outrageous parties.
Yeah, exactly. Hello and welcome to The Luxury Dispatch, the podcast that reveals the refined and the rare, people, items and stories that make up the luxury industry. I'm Tom Chamberlin, and today we shall be stepping into a world of long drives, hidden libraries, echoing halls, and the layers of history that cling to stone, wood and landscape. It is the world of stately homes. These houses are more than architecture. They are repositories of taste, power, patronage and craft. One might even say that the story of British luxury is written as much in country houses as it is in workshops and ateliers, or indeed the enduring craftsmanship of legacy brands such as Swaine. To help us explore that landscape, I'm joined by Alice Loxton, historian, writer, and one of the most engaging interpreters of Britain's past and the palaces that hold it. Alice, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
No, thank you very much for coming on. This is very exciting. Somebody who knows what they're talking about at long last. Where do we start from when we're talking about stately homes? Is there a point where it converted from being a sort of martial statement to something slightly more luxurious?
Yes, well, I think it's probably best to start from the beginning. Britain has a very long history of building quite impressive structures. So you could even go back as far as, say, 1066, following the Norman Conquest, when William the Conqueror was building all kinds of fortifications. So the likes of the Tower of London and Warwick Castle and Dover Castle. And these were, many of these have evolved into stately homes over the years. And these tell us a lot about what the medieval world was like, in that these are built as defensive structures.
Yeah.
They've got great castle walls, they've got arrow slits, they've got castellations. And so they are really built to reflect, or they are a great reflection of England at the time. We had William the Conqueror building, establishing himself in the new Norman dynasty, but then even during the time of Edward I, he subdued the Welsh, and in that period he built all of these castles along the Welsh border. And this was a time where there were skirmishes happening all the time, within England. So if you look at the Wars of the Roses, say, that was in the 1400s, there was fighting going on all the time. So you can see there was a real practical reason for it to be defensive. And you can look at places like Hever Castle, which later became the home of Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII. Or you could look at Leeds Castle, which again was lived in for hundreds and hundreds of years, all the way through to the 20th century. And these are surrounded by water. They are very much the classic fairy tale medieval castle in our mind's eye, if you like. But I think a point where it changes, and an important point in British history, is 1485, the Battle of Bosworth. It is the end of the Wars of the Roses, which was a very, very turbulent time, if you like. This was a period between the Yorkists and the Lancastrians. The country really divided in civil war, and that came to an end, unified under the Tudor dynasty, and we see that in the Tudor rose, the red and the white. And in the next century or so, we see this flowering of quite different palaces. First of all, they're not necessarily defensive in the way that they had been in the medieval period. So you might look at somewhere like Hampton Court Palace, which was built by Thomas Wolsey, and that is more in a kind of Renaissance palace sort of style, perhaps inspired by similar palaces in Europe. And these are much more kind of demonstrations of luxury and wealth than being practical defensive fortifications.
Yes.
And so that's a big moment of change. It's also a big moment in the Tudor period, of course, is it's one of the biggest moments of land change in British history with the dissolution of the monasteries, where huge swathes of land was seized by Henry VIII. All of the church land, the church was incredibly wealthy at this point.
Yep.
Lots of the land was seized and redistributed amongst his supporters. So if you ever go to a country house where it's called something abbey, it probably means that land was originally an abbey, perhaps Woburn Abbey, for example.
Yep.
So that's an interesting thing to look out for. And then in the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, we see this real flowering of what they call prodigy houses, which are these incredibly elaborate, incredibly decadent buildings, which are completely different to the castles you see in the medieval period. So a real classic example of this is Hardwicke Hall, which was the house of Bess of Hardwicke. And Bess of Hardwicke was the second wealthiest woman in England after Elizabeth I. And it's covered in windows, okay? The rhyme went, Hardwicke Hall, more glass than wall. And, if you think about, creating a defensive structure, well, glass is definitely not something good with that. So that gives you an indication of it being a time of peace. But it's an incredibly impressive structure. There's staterooms inside. It could have been a kind of royal palace in its own way. There's this beautiful long gallery with amazing portraits on the walls. So it's really splendid, I'd say, in all its different ways.
So when these buildings started to be built, was there a kind of a hesitance or a shyness around filling it with ornate and beautifully crafted things? Were there artists and craftsmen just ready to go as soon as people were saying, actually, I'm ready to commission you to do something? Because obviously prior to that, with all the castles and stuff, it had to be rudimentary and stick to its principal purpose, which is, as you say, defensive.
Well, absolutely. I mean, what we're forgetting here is that there were many, many craftsmen in the medieval period, exceptionally skilled at perhaps stained glass or working with metal, creating beautiful objects which are, covered in jewels. But of course, these were within the church. So these would have been working on the great cathedrals. If you imagine some of the shrines of medieval England, of which there were many, they are some of the most elaborate and ornate kind of works of art. And these were destroyed by Henry VIII. So we tend to forget about them. The churches would have been adorned with really beautiful wall paintings, of course, illuminated manuscripts, which were decorated with beautiful gold leaf, and a really high standard of craftsmanship. And so we had all of these skills within England at the time, but they weren't necessarily being used in the domestic settings. I mean, when you look at the Tudor period or the early Tudor period and the late medieval period, some of the most ornate private houses were those that were lived in by the churchmen, the bishops, that sort of thing. So we did have all of these skills, and I think they were ready to go, but it went to, the customer was different, if you like.
Well, what strikes us interesting is that it wouldn't be too long until dour old Oliver Cromwell would come along, and he wasn't particularly keen on all these kinds of things. But the origin of luxury is when the king would assign a commission to a craftsman to make something like special clothes, bit of furniture, saddlery, anything like that. And that craftsman would then, through the royal patronage, all the aristocrats would just swoop in and follow suit. Was there an architecture equivalent? I mean, was because the practices of creating, seating roses or trellises or anything that's to do with actually making a building is very different to something that's sort of practical personal use.
Well, it's interesting because, of course, before the Renaissance, before the it's a real big time of change, the 1500s, because before this point, we didn't really have individual famous architects or artists. They were more artisans or craftsmen. That's how they were perceived, of course. So it's very difficult when you're writing about paintings or architecture in the medieval period. Which you are
at the moment,
which I am, yes.
It's very exciting.
Which is something I found difficult because, I'm trying to bring these paintings to life, but we never know who the artists are. For example, this book that I've been writing about, this manuscript called The Luttrell Psalter, we just have to know it's a group of amazing artists who are in this monastic establishment, but we just don't know their names, and we never will. And that's just because of the changing perceptions of individual genius rather than general craftsmanship.
Okay,
right?
So who were generally the people who would first get stately homes?
It all originates from families who owned land, perhaps stretching back to the Norman Conquest. And it is just as the country changes and I suppose time goes on that the style of these houses changes in the way that we've discussed, from the castle to some of these prodigy houses, less about defence, more about luxury and showing off and conspicuous consumption. I think it's in the 1600s that you really see some of these incredibly ornate houses that we might consider to be stately homes.
Yeah. Because sometimes what I've noticed through documentaries and stuff is seeing that often the state give it to people for particular services to the state, which in my head, I sort of think that means the state already owned them. But in many cases, actually, the state sort of requisitioned them. So you talk about Hampton Court Palace, for example, which was Thomas Wolsey. At some point, that became the sort of retreat for the royal family. So they took it back, or they took it over. So the state had the power to requisition these houses and then give it to whoever they wanted ultimately.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Tudor period is chaotic in that manner because people are constantly coming in and out of favour. I mean, Thomas Wolsey, when he drops out of favour, it becomes a royal palace, and that's how it ends up in that way. Another example, though, for example, is Hever Castle, Anne Boleyn's house. So that is part of the Boleyn family. But that was actually given to another of Henry VIII's wives, Anne of Cleves. So it was where Anne of Cleves, wife number 4, went to stay after she'd been, rejected or...
pre-beheading.
That was she was the one who was the
Flanders
she was
divorced again, wasn't she?
Yeah. So she actually got off quite well because she just ended up at Hever Castle.
Yeah, very fine.
But some of these houses do go through quite hilarious changes of ownership in that dramatic period. But of course, the dissolution of the monasteries was the big one. Yeah. Where suddenly all of this this land that had been owned by the church was redistributed. But I mean, the big kind of gift, I suppose, of a monarch to a subject is Blenheim Palace.
Yes, which is the only non-episcopal palace, I believe.
Yeah, that's what people say, isn't it? And I think, it is a private home, which is a palace. And I think they call it that because it's just absolutely vast.
It is big, yeah. And it's called Blenheim Palace.
It is.
Close in the name. And which is still like one of the most famous, and Churchill was born there, and people sort of think of it as a real emblem of Britain, and it's still very popular.
Absolutely. I mean, I think Blenheim Palace is a kind of a high point if you want to talk about stately homes. It's like the real exemplar of absolute grandeur. It's got a massive estate, massive lands around it, just unbelievably grand. It is unusual, of course, because unlike other stately homes which have developed naturally through the centuries by the same family living there, it had this moment where it was built for a purpose, not really to be a family house, but to be a kind of commemoration, a celebration of a war. So it marks the 1704 Battle of Blenheim, which was part of the War of the Spanish Succession. And John Churchill, who was the great favourite of Queen Anne, he was the Duke of Marlborough, and he was married to Sarah Churchill, who is the figure in The Favourite people might have seen in that film. So it's that kind of strange relationship between the two women. But it was gifted to them, that land. And in the early part of the 18th century, this incredible palace was built there. And it is absolutely vast. I mean, this is a moment of the baroque. Yep. And the baroque is the most frivolous, extravagant, eccentric. It's not very British in many ways, but it is the most splendid, I suppose, of styles, I think. If we think about the Renaissance as the kind of divine perfection and balance and symmetry and order, or the Baroque, which comes from the word barocco, means misshapen pearl. And it's a kind of pushing the Renaissance a bit further, and it's pushing that perfection further to be flamboyant and fun and extravagant. So, in Blenheim Palace, they have, it's totally over the top, isn't it? When you go there, it's completely over the top. And there's all of these symbols of war. There's cannons and cannonballs and lions and spears. Inside there are paintings, trompe-l'oeil paintings, so these kind of visual optical illusions painted on the walls, and that in itself is quite playful and silly because you're kind of joking about whether you're looking at what you don't know what you're looking at quite, but also it's sometimes got sections where the kind of exterior architecture is positioned within the interior.
Yeah.
So all confusing and upside down, that kind of thing. So it's a fun kind of style, I think, and Blenheim is the real baroque kind of Vanbragh's real baroque masterpiece. And Vanbragh's having a big year this year. It's Vanbragh 300 years since his death, so you'll probably see a lot of Vanbragh things happening.
Maybe this is the first.
Yeah.
Whiz kicks that off. What's the kind of ratio between, for example, these places being the kind of primary seats of landowners who administered their land from these places, but then also I know that a lot of people in London used these houses as ways to get away from the kind of pestilence of London at the time. Whenever there was plague, smallpox, whatever, they would escape to these places. Hampton Court Palace was a really good example of that. You know, people think of Hampton as sort of being more or less a part of London, but actually back then it was quite a journey. So what's your sense of the divide between the two as a kind of place for play, but also a place for business or actually working the land that you own?
The big thing about the countryside houses is they're connected to a lot of land. So that would have been bringing in a huge amount of income, and it was until recent times. So there is a very practical need for these country estates, which is the family income. The London house might be because you might have to do business in London. You might have to be at court, that sort of thing, or be seen in the presence of the monarch.
Yeah.
So there are different roles for all these houses, and people did move around a great deal. So some very wealthy families would have had many houses, and we see in later years when they weren't able to pay death duties, they would be able to just get rid of one because they had others, in the portfolio. And people might have had various points houses abroad as well in later years. But I mean, you see in the Tudor period that some of these countryside houses were, they were built to expect a visit from the monarch, say. So that might have been an important role as well. And I think
a lot of people went bankrupt. From this
it did bankrupt quite a few people.
Yeah.
But I think that says quite a lot, because actually it indicates that this was, okay, you can have your house in London or whatever, but this is, probably the house which is attached to your title. This is the house which provides your income. So this is, much more of your identity and a demonstration of what your family, where your family is based and what they're connected to.
How big of a difference did the empire make to the landscape of stately homes?
Well, Henry VIII founded the Navy, right?
Sure.
And Henry VIII found the Navy, or Henry VII did really, but Henry VIII is really credited with expanding the Navy. In the years that followed, Britain had connections all around the world because of this naval influence. Really began under Elizabeth I, and then over the 1700s and 1800s.
She was sending out privateers to go and raid Spanish.
That's it, yeah. And also the East India Company was founded in these years. With that, all kinds of products come through. So all kinds of things like with the slave trade, we had all kinds of products like coffee and sugar and cotton. And this brought a huge amount of wealth. In the 1770s, 80% of foreign income came from the goods produced by enslaved people. So you can see how that, these kind of expansions could provide Britain with a lot of wealth, and that, those products would have come into places like Liverpool and been processed and sold on and everything. So, I mean, our ability to have a navy and to have these connections all around the world really brought in huge amounts of wealth to Britain's story, and the stately home is with that. And when you see some of the objects in these houses, beautiful objects, materials from all around the world, you see these influences and these trade routes coming in. But having said that, many of the designs of places like Blenheim or any of the houses in the 18th century, they're still influenced largely by ancient Greece, ancient Rome. So connections that we've had for many, many years with Italy and Greece. So they'll have classical columns, or they'll have pediments, or they'll have colonnades. It's not really, I don't think the connections with the rest of the world really influenced the design architecturally that much, and it was still very much based in what had been seen as the pinnacle of art and architecture in the Renaissance, which was the ancient classical world.
But perhaps the riches that came from the empire allowed the residents of these places to thrive within them. I mean, I imagine upkeep even back then was the kind of bête noire of any owner of a stately home.
Yes.
So
so if you're fuel definitely, like the wealth definitely come from around the world, but I think it's interesting that the style didn't really affect the style massively.
Yeah, they didn't change it. Yes, yeah, exactly. And so entertaining has always been a big part of stately homes. Should we sort of touch on that a little bit? Sometimes with quite bad consequences to the houses themselves.
Yeah.
But what goes on behind the doors of these places?
Yeah, well, what springs to mind? I was staying in Chipping Campden recently, and it's this old Camden house that was once stood there, and I was staying. You can stay. This is part of the Landmark Trust, which is a wonderful charity, and you can stay.
It's so good.
It's so good.
They did a TV show, which my wife and I are obsessed with, where they basically it's like an old like dairy farm, and they suddenly turn into this amazing place you can go stay at. It's brilliant. It is amazing. It is amazing what they do. So big up the Landmark Trust.
Yeah,
I'm
a huge fan. Yeah. So they restore all of these amazing kind of ruinous historic structures around the country, and then they let them out as short-term holiday lets, right? So I went to stay in one of them recently, and this was the remains of old Camden House. So this was originally a beautiful house in the Cotswolds, destroyed in the Civil War. That was another great period of destruction for lots of these castles and country houses.
Yeah, so interesting. I was thinking about that when you were talking about how the sort of 1500s, when these were starting to emerge, because sort of peacetime seemed to be coming, where then within a century the Civil War was going to come, and we'll be back at each other's throats.
Should have been built. Yeah, they're all thinking we should have put a moat in.
Yeah, exactly.
But in this, so with this house in Chipping Campden, the house doesn't exist anymore. But what does exist and what does remain, and for some reason they didn't bother to destroy it, is two buildings which stood either side of the house, incredibly ornate, with all sorts of quite wonderful architectural flamboyance, and these were banqueting houses, right? So they were built for the purpose of basically having dessert, a kind of after dinner party house, I suppose. And I just think that's so emblematic of, I suppose it's very hard to kind of think about our ancestors as having loads of fun and letting loose and everything. But they built two banqueting houses pretty close to each other, which is a real indication of how much they valued having a good time.
And of course, the introductions of things like hunting and shooting just kind of developed this whole capacity to do it often.
Yes, of course, yeah, and have guests and have visitors. I suppose, and folly. Think about follies. Why do they come about in the 1700s? These are just buildings that are built, as a folly. They are a folly in themselves. There is no point to them. They're just there for fun. But they were often used for entertaining. Yep. They were often dotted around the landscape as a way to, perhaps, you'd go there for tea or you'd go and have dinner there, but you'd also be able to demonstrate the estate and demonstrate the perhaps grounds designed by Capability Brown or someone like that, which might have another view, a vista of the house in the distance. So all of it is kind of different ways to show off the house. Yeah,
because obviously one of the things that everybody did back then was, certainly in the 18th century and 19th century, was go riding routinely in the morning. And so you'd want stuff further out from the house to be able to ride to and to show off and to sort of, so this is where the whole idea of the morning suit comes from. And so the jacket itself was designed to be ridden in, because people would ride out in the morning and that's what you would wear.
I see.
And now a word from our sponsors. In From Russia with Love, Ian Fleming included an ammo-stacked attaché case where Q Branch had modified the, quote, careful handiwork of Swaine and Aideney, end quote. Fleming was a man of great taste, so his plug was no accident, and indeed you can still get that case made today. However, Swaine began not with briefcases, but with whips and saddlery. This is 1750 London, pre-electricity, pre-railway, entirely horse-drawn, the centre of the world. This was the height of leather as a utilitarian item, and the best makers got the best patronage, which included Swaine as whip makers for King George III and 6 of his 7 sons. Royal whips would also be made for William IV, Queen Victoria, and they're still used in the royal household by the coachman of the Royal Mews. But saddlery has become the strand of DNA that you will see in the workshop on New Bond Street, which I highly recommend you going to see today, as it is very rare to see craftsmanship of this level inside London. When Swaine moved from saddlery into leather goods, it was merely a change of application and not quality or material. The Industrial Revolution created paper Paper created bureaucracy, and bureaucracy created the need to transport authority in a structured form. Suddenly, the man who once controlled horses now controls documents. Same discipline, different arena. One of the things I find amusing about modern quiet luxury discourse is that it's presented as if it were invented in 2023. Bridal leather has always been quiet, and good bridal leather behaves differently from fashion leather. It develops a patina. It softens in the right places. The handle learns your grip. The end of the Great War signalled in a shrinking whip market and a need to diversify and meet the needs of a new generation. Edward Swaine, Edney Jr., who took over the business in 1898, said that it was not about selling a sense of Englishness, but that his international clients got the highest possible standards available. And that is what made it English. Swaine has since then been the go-to London gentleman's destination for leather. Royal warrants, politicians, icons of cinema. The modern evolution is quite clever too. Take their Salisbury briefcase, a classic of the brand, which has been remade and relaunched as the Salisbury 2, with reinforced handles and added gusset, designed to carry a laptop instead of parchment. It acknowledges that while the world changes, structure still matters. There's something psychologically grounding about a structured leather bag in a digital world. It speaks to a perennial attitude in an ephemeral world. The tangibility of carrying something is then going to be treated with that much more reverence and care. And the other thing to remember is that this brand was born between city and countryside. Saddles to briefcases, whips to folios. That duality still exists. They make things for people who might go from a boardroom to a shooting estate without changing character. It's less about fashion, more about permanence. This approach is clearly working, as they're opening internationally. Montreux already, Paris and Beverly Hills next, trunk shows in Dallas and New York. But the centre of gravity remains, and always shall be, London. And that's important, because heritage only works if it continues. The campaign line this year is a quiet authority. Leather is exactly that. It doesn't shout, it doesn't logo slap, it doesn't beg attention, but it does endure. And in a culture obsessed with speed, endurance is starting to feel rather luxurious. Britain had, because when people talk about the jet set in the 50s and 60s, we think of the Italians and the French and the Americans in the south of France. But before that, we had the period of the coterie and Britain in its real heyday of riches and idle, the idle youth and the idle rich, and country houses played a big part in this. In fact, actually, Jesus in Worcester, the TV show, is a great demonstration of these amazing houses, because Bertie's constantly going out to see his aunt in one of the Topley Towers and things like that. But they were places where it wasn't necessarily always a Jane Austen kind of waltzing and chivalry and things. They became quite sort of dare I say it, risque. And so there was a man named Wolf Bonato. He was one of the Bentley boys. He was the one who raced the blue train from the south of France to London and beat it. And his car, it was a Bentley blower, was the kind of star guest at the Savoy and sat in the centre of the big table as a kind of sort of party to celebrate his race. But no, he used to hold huge parties up at his house, and his house was called Arden Run. And in 1933, he had one of his big parties and burnt the whole thing down.
Good gracious.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
shocking.
Yeah. So it was just people got up to all sorts of mischief and with ruinous consequences.
Yeah, it wasn't just civil wars that were bringing these houses down.
Yeah, exactly.
It's outrageous parties.
Yeah, exactly. Was there, do you think, in your mind, a kind of heyday for the stately home in terms of not only when they were being built, but when they were the sort of social centre of Britain's society?
A big moment and a big theme that we should definitely talk about is the Grand Tour, which is when young men who were aristocratic heirs, they would soon inherit these great estates, or perhaps even had at that point, would go out to Italy, often Italy, Greece, perhaps other places in Europe too, France, and they would go and become cultured in terms of learning about the kind of the artistic gems that were out there. But they would also buy lots of objects which were actually antique objects, or even great works of art from the Renaissance, and they would bring them back to their houses, and they would furnish their houses with these wondrous pieces of art. And so lots of the houses that we see today, if you go and walk around stately homes, much of the art, much of the interior decoration has come from those trips, and that is why lots of them have a particular kind of slant towards the classical world, partially because when they then returned to their country house, they would also ask them to redesign it in this way that was inspired by ancient Greece, ancient Rome. So I do think that was a moment where perhaps the idea in our mind of what a stately home or a country house might be was kind of consolidated, because there was a real style. We're probably talking about the 1780s, the 1790s. That was a real style where lots of them were designed in a very, very particular way.
Yeah.
I mean, a really important architect at this time was Robert Adam. When he was younger, he went to Split, and he looked at the Palace of Diocletian, and he did lots of drawings and kind of recorded what he found there, and lots of that inspired his work and his designs, and he went on to design lots of important buildings, including parts of Edinburgh Newtown as well. So it's not just the country houses, it's also the kind of urban architecture as well in this period, and lots of parts of London. There was a street called the Adelphi bit, which is by the Strand. That was all this big kind of complex by the Adam brothers, but Spencer House as well was a big design around this time. So
because there are such a thing as London stately homes, aren't there? So you've got, as you say, Spencer House, Apsley House, there was Burlington House.
I know. Well, London used to be covered with all these massive houses. Devonshire House was an amazing one, and lots of them have been, because
people don't realise when they go visit the Royal Academy, they're visiting Burlington House. That's
which, when you think about it, and you think about all of those young aristos in London having those massive houses and just going to different parties around London, it must have been outrageous.
Must have been nuts. And so, I mean, because this is a thought that's occurred to me, because you were talking about the sort of hesitation from these people to constantly upgrade things. At one point, though, there would have had to have been various things for sort of hygiene purposes or technology purposes, like plumbing, wiring, things like that. When that happened, did that cause a sort of an issue for the owners? Did they have to do lots of rebuilds, or was it fairly straightforward to do? I just thinking about it, because it's quite a big thing. You never build a house now and say, in 5 years I'll put in plumbing.
This is true. I mean, I think they were rebuilding things all the time.
Right.
And they were constantly building new houses in that period. Sometimes they might have been on the site of, Blenheim Palace is on the site of Woodstock Palace, which is a medieval palace. So they were constantly knocking down and rebuilding, and everything was kind of going all the time. So even though it might have been rooted in very old architectural styles and things, perhaps a style that to us doesn't look like it's changed much, they were constantly editing and changing things and moving things around.
Were the royal houses that we know today were they notable in, were they particularly advanced? But I mean, certainly Buckingham Palace was only built, Queen Victoria moved in after she was. It was
the House of Buckingham. I think that's why it's called that.
Yes.
So it was it wasn't a royal house originally, and then they bought it, and then they moved in. So
because she was at Kensington Palace, and she moved around a lot.
Yeah. So Kensington Palace was Queen Victoria's. That's where she grew up.
Yeah.
But Buckingham Palace is obviously the big one now. And well, the historic royal palaces they are now known are the Tower of London, Hampton Court, Buckingham Palace, and Kensington Palace. That's like the organisation that manages them, and Holyrood House as well in Scotland.
There's Windsor Castle,
and of course Windsor Castle. Yeah, so there's quite a few around.
With Sandringham and so forth.
Yeah.
And so, but was there the expectation that the royals would always have the pick of the bunch?
That's why Blenheim Palace is interesting, because before that point, I think the royals did have the largest houses, right? They had the most impressive houses, and it would be quite something to try and upstage them. It would be the not done thing. So the great houses would be places like Hampton Court Palace, or there was a great palace on Whitehall which no longer survives. The only bit of that which survives is the banqueting house, which is this amazing ceiling by Inigo Jones. The rest of it burnt down at the end of the 19th century. But what is extraordinary in the 18th century is that because we have all this wealth coming in from around the world, people have this independent wealth that they're building these incredibly extravagant quasi palaces, I suppose, and that's why we suddenly see all of these beautiful houses arising and people living in houses which are much grander than what the royals might be putting up with.
Have you heard of Trentham Hall?
Yes, I have. Yes,
right. Great.
Which there's that amazing quote.
Yes, from the Shah of Persia said to the then Prince of Wales and soon to be Edward VII, "This is too grand for a subject. You've got to lop his head off when you become king."
Yeah, he will. Yeah, he will outshine you. Surely.
But it is it's quite a good house to discuss because ultimately that fell victim to the 20th century sort of demolishing of stately homes. Yeah. So let's move on to the 20th century, the wars, and how these homes suddenly became imperiled, not because of blitzes and so forth, but because of internal issues that meant that they had to be destroyed.
If we think that the peak of stately homes maybe was the late 18th century and the 19th century, where there was a huge amount of wealth coming in, I think the sad decline of the stately home does come in the 20th century. There is a reason, there's various reasons for that. I mean, the first thing to say is that there were so many staff supporting these places and they required a huge number of people just to keep them going. And you get a sense of that in Downton Abbey. In the First World War, a big problem was a massive loss of labour. Lots of the staff, huge amounts of people died in the First World War, and that represented a chunk of staff who and indeed those who lived in the houses and inherited them. But there was also a big problem with inheritance. This is something that had existed in the late 19th century, but we see rising levels of inheritance tax throughout the 20th century. So it actually starts before the First World War. Yeah. In 1894, death duties, as they were known, were set at 8% on estates worth over 1 million. And we see the impact of this on houses such as Trentham Hall, which we lost in 1910s. In 1919, death duties were 40% on estates worth more than 2 million. And by 1940, it was 65%. So you can see a real jump up there. It was
amazing also the fact that during the demolishing, they tried to these families were trying to kind of flog the inside. There was an advert for Trentham Hall of buy the sort of urns that would have been, so the stone urns that would have been on the roof of these buildings, trying to sort of sell off these things just to kind of get a little bit of cash.
Yeah, I know. It is sad to look at it, and so of course, because it was becoming so expensive to have these estates, it was cheaper often to sell them off or just to knock them down.
Yes, inheritance tax was huge after the Second World War, and the rules for planning permission and restoration was also extremely limited. The government were just not letting anybody fix anything.
I see, yeah.
So things were falling very much into disrepair. And think about the staff thing. There was a story about, I think it was during the Great War but it could have been the Second World War, when the government went to the Duke of Devonshire and said, "We understand that your Grace needs a butler and a footman and an underfootman and livery staff and coachman and all these sorts of things. But does your Grace really need 2 pastry chefs?" And his reply was, "Good God, can a man not have a biscuit?"
Yeah, quite right.
Quite right.
But it's interesting. I think the role of country houses and stately homes in the Second World War and the First World War in this period is really important as well, because they suddenly are used for the public good in a strange way. So if you take, for example, Blenheim Palace, and you take the long library, it's got this amazing library there. At one end, statue of Queen Anne, who was the great benefactor of the estate originally. At the other end, it's got this amazing organ. And just so many books. It's like a fairy tale library in lots of ways. In the First World War, this was used as a hospital, so troops would be recovering here. In the Second World War, they had evacuees here from Malvern College, so they had loads of school children there. And this, it's a completely different way of using these spaces. And there's this wonderful story from Blenheim where the current Duke of Marlborough received a letter some 20 years ago now, and it was obviously written from a wife of one of the boys who had been there as evacuees, and it said, what's the word? Oh yeah, it said, "It was my husband's dying wish that you should have these," and enclosed in this anonymous letter were 3 tiny pipes from the organ. And obviously they'd stolen these
Been
boys.
naughty and stolen. That's
these
so
evacuee
nice.
boys had stolen it from the organ, and he'd spent his whole life, even until his deathbed, he'd spent his whole life feeling guilty that he'd stolen these pipes. This boy who grew up to be an old man eventually, but eventually sent it back.
That's such a nice story.
Yeah.
And I think the requisitioning is a really interesting aspect of the story of stately homes and so on, because literally thousands and thousands of casualties would have been put up in these places because, they are big.
They're big,
They're big places, and so can house lots of people. And so for hostels, schools. I know that Sir Philip Sassoon, probably one of the great, best dressed politicians of all time, he had he had 2 stately homes, and it was used by, I think it was naval intelligence for interrogations and things like that. Yeah. So there was sometimes for military purposes, sometimes for educational purposes and medical, so they were put to all kinds of use.
Yeah. And it wasn't just stately homes. Think about Oxford University was full of, I think the examination halls in Oxford University was full of troops just returned from France, in all kind of states of distress.
Yeah.
So it must have been a complete upheaval, those years of war, both times, where all of these institutions, which have had a very particular purpose for many, many years, suddenly that was all upturned.
And also, crucially, the sons of the owners of these places were often going to fight and often dying.
Yeah.
And so the lines of succession were just shot to pieces, literally.
Yeah.
And so families, just the titles died out because no one had a living heir. There were lots and lots of purposes. So thinking about that, what do you think we lose every time one of these homes gets demolished?
Well, as we've discussed, there is such a long history of many of these houses. Even if they were only built in the 18th century, they probably stand on a site that's had people inhabiting it for many, many centuries before that. So I think it's you have to think about them not just as kind of these grand houses of the rich and the powerful, but actually as these kind of microcosms, an insight into Britain's story over hundreds and hundreds of years. And I think when you watch films, series like Downton Abbey, you do get the sense that these are almost mini towns in their own right. They're like a kind of mini version of bigger events. So it's not just these kind of insights into art and architecture, often at the forefront of creating these really beautiful spaces, but also these tell the story and have reflected the lives of millions of people collectively who have lived in there, worked there, contributed in all sorts of different ways, not just those upstairs, but those downstairs as well, and more so those downstairs, I'd say.
Yes, for sure.
To every time, it is such a kind of core thread in our story, as are churches and cathedrals, but stately homes, because of their connection to the land and because of their connection to the people in that land, and the churches in those places as well. I mean, they're just so embedded in our story that to lose any is a real loss.
There are plenty. It might be hard to whittle down to a short list, but which of the houses do you think tells the truest story of Britain? And we can't go back to Blenheim Palace, we have to find some others.
Yes. One of my favourite houses to go and visit is Hatfield House, not far from London. It was here at Old Hatfield House, this beautiful Tudor red brick building with this wonderful kind of formal garden. And this is where Elizabeth I, as a young girl, grew up. And it's also in the grounds here that there's this Elizabeth Oak, where the original tree is supposedly where Elizabeth I was told the news that her sister had died and she was to be queen. And she utters the words, apparently, "It is the Lord's doing and it is wonderful in our eyes," which
She's
is not normally what people say when they hear about their sister's death. But, that's the Tudor family for you.
She had bigger fish to fry. Big news coming her way. Interesting you mention it, because funny enough, I have here a whip from Hatfield House. Now, this was made by Swaine, who were whipmakers to, I mean, as far back as George III and 5 of his 6 sons. So not all 6, not quite. They didn't manage all 6, but they got 5 of the 6.
Wow, well, that's a good number. But this would have been. So there was another house at Hatfield, that's the Burley family, and that's Elizabeth's advisor builds this another like magnificent house next to the other
amazing.
One. So it must be from that generation. Well, I think one of the most extraordinary things about British history and many of these houses is that they are incredibly old, and they offer a cross-section of centuries and centuries of change and development. So for me, the most exciting ones are the ones which really tap into every moment of that story. You know, Blenheim Palace isn't one of those because it starts in the beginning of the 18th century very abruptly. But if you take, for example, Warwick Castle, which has foundations in the time of William the Conqueror, which is just so wild to me. You know, some of the historic organizations at the moment are planning their 1,000-year anniversary. Like, that is so crazy, that amount of time. But Warwick Castle is particularly old, but you know, over the years it is a kind of military fortress, and the Earl of Warwick is using it during the
is Warwick Castle the one with the oubliette, the sort of the sort of hole that people just got thrown in,
nightmarish bit, which you go down these steps and you go into this dark area, and then there's this kind of small kind of section and opening in the side of the wall, and that's the oubliette or oubliette. I don't, people say it different ways, but it's supposedly where they would just put people in and leave them to forget, is what it means. But it's interesting that it goes through all of these developments over the years, and you can go and visit there, and you can go into all the different kinds of interiors, and then even up to the modern day, and you can see the Victorian, the kind of lavishness in the Victorian period in the 20s, and that's replicated in many different houses. So if you look at Leeds Castle, which we mentioned earlier, which is a classic medieval castle surrounded by a moat, in the 20s, Lady Bailey, who was the lady who lived there, she hosted so many glamorous people, and it really had a great revival, and people like Charlie Chaplin were there, great writers, like honestly the most glamorous people in that period, in the 20s and 30s. And another important kind of thing to think about is that many of these houses had huge amounts of injections of cash from American buyers at various points. So another example is Hever Castle. It was originally built in the 13th century. Again, beautiful medieval castle surrounded by a moat. In the Tudor period, it was lived in by the Boleyns, Anne Boleyn, Anna Cleves, and it fell into various moments of decline, and it was rescued by the Astors. So William Waldorf Astor, who was one of the richest men in America, swooped in, bought it, and created this massive wing, the Astor Wing. It's basically a village. But that, and he again, like Lady Bailey at Leeds Castle, would host loads of glamorous people there, and you know, it was the place to be. The social set would be there, sort of thing. And so you see a sort of pickup of that house's journey in an unexpected way. But again, it's where the money's come from. In the 18th century, there was a lot of money in these houses because of Britain's international reach. In the 20th century, it's often because it's the Americans who come in and support it. Yeah. So it's a surprising journey. And another thing to say about these houses, and it's that they are often at the forefront of not only art and design, but also technology.
Yeah.
You know, Vita Sackville-West, who was the great writer, and she grew up at one of the greatest houses in the country, which is Knoll in Sevenoaks in Kent. It was a house that was it's called a calendar house because supposedly it's got 365 rooms. Actually, it's got more than that, but you know, they loved saying that, and it's incredibly ornate. It's one of the great houses of the National Trust collection. And she writes about when she's a young girl that her glamorous parents would have these parties, and they'd be trying out the most forward technology for that moment, which might be the electric lamps or electricity in all its various different ways. So really, it was the desire to show off, I suppose, that pushed quite a lot of technology in at various points.
Yeah, and you mentioned the National Trust, and I guess preservation and conservation is a really important aspect of this. The big question, the big sort of controversy around stately homes for the families that live in them is the idea that you might be the last member of the family to have ownership, and you don't want to be the one to give away the keys.
Yeah.
And nevertheless, the National Trust, English Heritage, lots and lots of different companies do now take ownership under certain, there's various rules that so the family can stay living there, but they have to stay in a specific area. They have to open it to the public and all these sorts of things. Which do you think is a more helpful way of keeping these places alive? The private ownership, where the families, as intended, as it were, keep it using their own money to kind of, fix the roof or polish the brass or whatever, or have the National Trust take it over and run it as an enterprise where the public can go see it?
Yeah, well, I think, every house is a case-by-case basis. I think it is a really wonderful thing when a family who has lived in a house for hundreds of years still lives in that house and can find a way to sustain it. The practical reality is that these houses were built with a great amount of land attached, and that land through the rents supported the house.
Yep.
Generally, these houses today don't have that land, and so they are incredibly expensive to maintain, to care for. It's very difficult to raise enough money to do that, and so it's a real struggle for lots of families. And though I think it is wonderful that, to keep these stories alive and to keep, the families are themselves part of the fabric of the house.
Yeah,
and story.
My friend Darcy Wyville, his family, there's a sort of picture or painting up in the house. It's Constable Burton Hall up in Yorkshire, and there's this lovely sort of an illustration of all the knights that went over with William the Conqueror, the Norman Conquest, and there's one shield. There were lots of shields with all names underneath. One of the shields said De Wyville. So, Darcy Wyville still, thousands or 1,000 years
that's amazing,
later. It's amazing because you see all the painting, the portraits going back over these years, they look quite similar. It's sort of, you can see it all in them, and but they all share names. Marmaduke is one of the names of the family that keep being passed down, and
no, that's cool.
It's just one of the it's just those lovely traditions, which is also, I think, a real part of the fabric of why a lot of the rest of the world see us as rather charming. They really like that. The Americans bought into it largely probably because they saw it as that. America is an ambitious, aspirational country, and if they wanted to sort of see themselves as at the sort of upper echelons of society and stuff, they turned to Britain and married into it.
But so I think, there is an advantage to, and it is really wonderful when there are these houses where the family still lives there, but practically that's not always possible. So what is the solution? Well, there are various organisations who have come up with various different solutions. The National Trust is the one that most people have heard of. It was founded in 1895, and their model is they take on historic houses and landscapes which are cannot be supported, sometimes in lieu of inheritance tax, and they open them up to the public. So you might be able to go 9 till 5 as a visitor. Now, this is wonderful because suddenly all kinds of people can go and visit these houses which were once privately owned and behind closed doors, and they are cared for by conservators. To look after all of these paintings is a hugely expensive thing to do, and also you need expertise. So there really is advantages to that. The disadvantage, perhaps you might say, is that it's very much kind of stuck in its time, like the story has come to an end, if you like, because it's being preserved in that moment. It's not going to develop in a way that a country house might have done over the centuries. There's not going to be the new technology that's been put in as they did in years past. But there are other options here. I mean, another organisation is called Historic Houses, and they support privately owned houses, and they will open them up to the public in various different ways. So you could get a tour with somebody who actually lives in the house, which is cool. Or the Landmark Trust, which we've mentioned. I think that's actually a really, really wonderful compromise again, because a problem perhaps with the National Trust is that when you go around, you're very passive. These houses are used, they become museums, and they have a tourist route, which is, has its advantages. But what's so amazing about the Landmark Trust is you go and stay in a historic house for 3 days. It's your house. So you're waking up in this historic house, you're having dinner with your friends and family there, and it almost feels like they're still being lived in and shared in a different way. And
you're playing your part in that by staying there.
Yeah, I mean, all of them are great, these organisations, because by staying there or by visiting the National Trust, by being a member of all these things, you are supporting their conservation. So And I think it's good that we have a mix. You know, maybe it's good that they're not all privately owned, because otherwise nobody would ever. I mean, imagine if you could never go and visit unless you happen to know someone who lived there.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, that would be a shame.
The numbers are good as well for these visiting. You know, whether it's private, national trusts, whatever. So it's 20 million visitors a year. It's a lot of people.
Yeah.
And that supports tens of thousands of jobs, and it's over $1 billion worth of revenue as well. So it's hard, whilst it's not necessarily the biggest industry in the nation, it's not necessarily defunct. It's not redundant. And frankly, I don't think enough effort is put into it to help promote it. And obviously, now that it's out on the Luxury Dispatch, people will be flooding there in their droves. This is going to be sponsored by the Landmark Trust in a couple of weeks or something. And I'm encouraged by that, but I also do believe, and I know it's not necessarily your job to believe as a historian, it's your job to look at facts and just present those, as they come to you. But as a Brit, culturally, I feel an association with it in the same way that I feel an association with tartan and bagpipes, despite not being Scottish.
Yes.
You know, there's it's in some way I feel like it is a part of me, and I'm proud of that.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a core part of the British brand.
Yeah.
You know, in the same way that parish churches are, and that view of the cricket pitch and the pub and the church. Or, you know, there is a reason that fashion shoots and TV and films, they always go to country houses and stately homes.
Yes, that's true.
And I think we take it for granted because we live here and we've grown up with it. But it's very striking when you go abroad how much they associate, you know, and are perhaps more excited by it than we are, and associate it with the idea of Britain.
So, Alice, we haven't touched on landscaping. No. We've not really touched on architecture. We've done a lot, but then not very much at all. Yeah. We could probably do 3 or 4 more episodes on this. But in the meantime, thank you so much for coming in. I think it was a totally fascinating conversation. And I think we've set our stall for rescuing these homes, if indeed they need rescuing at all.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's been great fun.
I remain Tom Chamberlin, and this has been The Luxury Dispatch, the podcast that looks at how luxury is shaped not only by objects, but by the history, place and people who preserve both. My thanks to Alice Loxton for guiding us through the world of stately homes, and to Swaine for their support of the programme and for their continued commitment to the kind of craftsmanship that so often fills these historic spaces. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please do like, subscribe and leave a comment. We read every one. Tell us the houses that have stayed with you, the histories you would like us to uncover, or the corners of the luxury world you think deserve attention. Thank you for listening, and happy dressing.